It's hard to believe that life started in water, huh? When it comes to Yu-Gi-Oh archetypes, I don't think there's any archetype that is more odd-looking than the Paleozoics in my mind. And when they are compared to their original counterparts, it's easy to see why they are considered, well, weird. Now, I'm not talking about those archetypes that just have weird choices of artwork as a whole, for instance, just having a sexy woman put on everything, but I'm talking about archetypes where it's just weirdness through and through. However, when it came to the Paleozoics, they're possibly the most unique out of a bunch since they are based on possibly what's the earliest forms of life on Earth. Technically not the earliest forms of life, but we do know that these guys are very, very old. You see, the Paleozoics were based off of an extinct form of life that were around during the Cambrian period. This period is also known as the Cambrian explosion, where a whole bunch and fiesta of life just popped up out of nowhere and just started to take advantages of everything around them. From things such as small herbivores to even a behemoth of a predator. Now, here comes a downside for me in this certain aspect of paleontology and Yu-Gi-Oh! When it comes to paleontology as a whole, my expertise is only in dinosaurs. I'm not good with extinct mammal life, I'm not good with extinct life before the dinosaurs, and the only ones I'm remotely interested in is the Cambrian explosion period, where these guys are based off. And seeing that these guys are practically coastal life forms as well, they're not my expertise. But I do know somebody who is an expert when it comes to wildlife, when it comes to ecological zones like that. Plus, at the same time, it would be nice to hear what he has to say about this as a whole. So, I'm gonna let my friend take it away from here.
So you may be wondering, what on earth are we doing in the mountains? Aren't we supposed to be looking at aqua-type Paleozoic monsters? And you would be correct, but in order to study and understand the Paleozoic era, we have to go to where we can actually find the fossils. And this is here in the Burgess Shale deposits of British Columbia. Now, if we go ahead and look at this rock, which dates back from over 541 million years ago, we can get an idea of what these ancient Paleozoic seas look like. So one of the first paleo monsters that we are going to take a look at is Leoncholia. Now luckily, the name in the Yu-Gi-Oh card text translates exactly as it does in real life, so we don't have to worry about any confusion in terms of naming convention. And Leoncholia is a group of arthropods that come from the larger group called Megachirins. These groups are known for their long appendages, as you can see even on the card artwork, which they use to peruse about their environment, and they can use to catch prey items to bring them in for feasting. Now, interestingly enough, as intimidating as this monster looks with its large gaping appendages and everything, it is actually quite small. In real life, you'd probably say it's around 5 centimeters or so. You can just plop that right into your hand. It doesn't seem that intimidating, but it's a very strong, well-built arthropod and has a nice tough casing, which means it can peruse about its environment and go after other well-built tough arthropods of the Cambrian period. Now, just because we are in the Cambrian explosion, where we're seeing such a wide, vast variety of new species, it doesn't mean that all species are on the same line where we're seeing a very vast diversity of arthropods in this community. We're also seeing some more unique creatures that we don't really see in today's ecology and ecosystems right now. For example, Eldonia, or Paleozoic Eldonia is the famous trap card in Yu-Gi-Oh! This monster, or this actual real-life organism, is actually a soft-bodied organism, kind of similar to cnidarians and medusa-like forms that you can see in jellyfish, but we don't really see it in the modern day, and scientists are still trying to figure out what group of organisms would it be more closely related to, or what phyla would it be classified under. Now, Eldonia are very common, and they what appears to be a soft-bodied organism forming colonies similar to how jellyfish in the modern day you'll see in the water column aggregate in one large area. So you can kind of get an idea of this is most likely their behavior pattern, flowing up and down in the currents, feeding in the water column, as opposed to active predators perusing on the seafloor like Leonchoilias. And as we continue to peruse through this Cambrian environment, you can notice there's such a wide and weird variety of life swimming around in these waters. For example, Opabenia, or Paleozoic Opabenia as known in the Yu-Gi-Oh! Trading card game, these monsters are so weirdly developed, and they're very small. Once again, a lot of creatures, although there are some large, gigantic species like Anomalocaris, there are so many small but uniquely adapted predators perusing through this environment. For example, Opabenia likes to peruse on the bottoms of the seafloor, using this large proboscis to go and grab soft-bodied prey items and bring them back to its mouth so that it can feast, and having such a wide and unique display, having the strange fan-shaped tail along with the multiple several eyes on the top of its head. It has a very unique body plan and very interesting, kind of similar to how segmented worms look like today. But don't get fooled by its weird and friendly, cuddly, squishy appearance. It is still a predator. So the Cambrian period is a very vast, explosive period of life. It is essentially an evolutionary arms race. Who has the ability to adapt the fastest and most effectively to this very brand new and changing, explosive and biodiverse environment? You can go the route which many arthropods were going, bulking up, getting big, getting armored plating, and just protecting yourself and being a tank. Or you could also go the route of what some of our earliest ancestors are doing, developing inner structures and the first backbone, as we are starting to see our first fish ancestors develop. And in the long term, you could argue that that route would prove to be the most effective and end up dominating the earth. So I hope you've enjoyed this segment with me here today in the Cambrian period. And just keep in mind, every time you go outside and you find an old rock, it probably has a story to tell, or it's hiding some secrets underneath of an ancient creature that you may even find in the modern day game of Yu-Gi-Oh!
Thanks again to RainingCardGames for helping me out with this. Go subscribe to his channel. If you don't, you're dead to me. So there are a few things that RainingCardGames did say that we're going to be tackling in this video as well. Now, usually in Paleontology and Yu-Gi-Oh! I look at the card's artwork, effects, and see how well they reflect their original counterpart. However, with the Paleozoics, we're only going to be looking at the artwork. Simply put, with them all being trap monsters, there's rarely any point. Look, let's be quite frankly honest, they're traps, they act like traps, and they barely do anything that resembles their original counterparts as a whole. The only thing that they have remotely close to their original counterparts in terms of what they do as effects is their attack and defense values along with their levels. So with that being said, we're just going to carry on and move along to our first Paleozoic in this video. Candina is the first one we are looking at, and to be quite frankly honest, it's a very interesting one that we're looking at, primarily because, well, this is another one of the worms that I mentioned. The animals in the Cambrian explosion were separated into soft bodies and hard bodied animals, and Candina is one of few soft bodied animals. But, unlike one of those soft bodied animals, this one was capable of swimming around a place. This came to its advantage as well, knowing that it was a predator at the same time. Now, it didn't attack like any other predator of the time period, or any other predator mostly of what you would expect today to behave like. It actually attacked like a sea star. Yes, that's how marine biologists prefer to call starfish. They prefer to call them sea stars because that's their technical terminology and that's what they were originally given. By that, it actually hovers over its prey until it's at an appropriate position. Then, it launches out its stomach towards its prey and actually starts digesting them from that point onwards. So a pretty gruesome way to go, wouldn't you agree? However, shockingly enough, it's not the biggest predator in its time period. Not even by a mile. Now, what Raining said as well is also true about the monsters' overall names. The names of the actual card games share the one-to-one name of the original counterparts, which makes our jobs here a hell of a lot more easier, thank goodness. Unfortunately, that's all I could find of Candina, which is kind of a shame, really. When it came to analysing these guys as a whole during the conference of the release, all the Paleozoics actually had some form of interesting history behind them during their discussion, especially knowing that these guys are just as old in terms of their discovery as a T-Rex. These guys were practically just 100 years old up until now, whereas a Tyrannosaurus was around about 130 years old in terms of its discovery. So, quite the close span of discovery age, but at the same time, kind of shocking to realise that there's, well, nothing else in terms of knowing of what it can do. But the others actually do have some interesting aspects behind them. Raining also mentioned trilobites, including Olonoides and Morella in terms of this evolutionary tree. All of the trilobites actually have a gigantic history around them. I could go into great detail about these guys already, but I'd be here for literally hours just trying to talk about them. But if you guys do want to have an in-depth analysis on these things as a whole, I heavily recommend the David Attenborough documentary known as First Life. You'll be surprised in what you see. But to make a long story short, each trilobite had its own unique armor shape, its own unique behavior style in terms of predator and prey, and its own unique weapons and defense mechanisms in order to counteract everything around them, and possibly the most oddest set of eyes anyone will ever see. No, seriously, there's a trilobite that actually has an eye that covers 3/4 of its entire head. It's fucking ridiculous. Moving back to soft bodies real quickly, we have Pikaia. Now, Pikaia for me suffers the same fate as Candina. There was nothing remotely interesting about it. However, unlike Candina, this one was actually a herbivore, or a scavenger. I can't remember which one. Regardless, though, it wasn't the most aggressive of all the Paleozoic animals. However, it was important as it laid the groundwork for a lot of worm-based life forms on Earth from here on out. Okay, so the final two that I have for you are literally the key definition of oddballers, but before I move on to those, here's an example of what I mean by a unique history with the Paleozoics by going back to the conference from what RainingCardGames introduced. He mentioned a monster known as Oboblemia. Here is its fossil. Now, when this one was actually introduced to the conference with all the other paleontologists in the room, it was actually laughed at. So imagine just having these other two fossils being presented to you, and having the weird task of just trying to figure out how the hell they're supposed to behave. I think a good one that represents this is Hallucigenia. Now, in the artwork of Hallucigenia, it actually represents its incorrect analogy very, very perfectly. Now, earlier on in the video, you may have seen this image. This is Hallucigenia corrected. You see, Hallucigenia was reconstructed in the wrong way up. It had those weird things on top of its body and those spikes at the bottom of its body, and that's what everyone originally thought Hallucigenia looks like. Turns out it was the other way around, because those spikes were a defense mechanism. Hallucigenia was also an herbivore, and a very small one, just roaming around the area. Just naturally grazing the bottoms of the floor, just gathering up any forms of scavenged material it could find to just neutralize itself. It was a very odd ball of a herbivore, but at the same time, it was even odder when it was reconstructed. Finally, there's Deinonychus, and oh, wait a minute. There we are. Now, you possibly may be thinking to yourselves, why the hell did I censor this card? Well, it's mainly because of the just odd anatomy that this thing had. So here's how Deinonychus usually went. Its lifespan is actually kind of interesting. As soon as it gives birth to a new Deinonychus, it roams around the area to find a new place to make its own home. It sticks itself into the ground, and then filter feeds throughout everything around it. However, that's not the odd part about Deinonychus, because this is the odd part about Deinonychus. Its mouth is literally located next to its anus. Do you see why now I have to censor that damn card? Keep this in mind, this was during the time where the Cambrian explosion was experimenting with the earliest forms of organisms that will become the modern day organisms. So stuff like a complete digestive tract and such were actually making its debut in this time period. And some animals were getting kinda creative on how they could practically feed themselves, as well at the same time how to get rid of any wastes. Okay, you've waited long enough for this guy, and obviously, when it comes to the Cambrian period, this guy is literally an icon. He is the most iconic one out of a lot, and for very, very, very good reasons. But let's go into the history behind this guy first. When his fossils was first discovered, a lot of people originally thought there were 3 fossils comprised into one from one area. A form of squid similar to shell squids, a worm, and at the same time some form of shrimp. However, when it came to the full discovery of an animal being completely recreated, they realized they were wrong the entire time. All 3 of those pieces were all one piece. The shelled squid, its mouth. The weird worm thing, an appendage that comes from the front of its jaws. And the whole squid-like shape that was completely separated from it? Nope, that was the rest of its body. Anomalocaris. There's a lot more to this animal than you may originally expect, and when I say a lot more, I legitimately mean a whole lot more. Those 2 big round things on the top of its head? Yeah, those are its eyes, giving it a perfect 3D vision for both in front, behind, and above it. Those pincer things at the front is what it uses to grab hold of prey, and believe it or not, its mouth is a disc that's literally right beneath it. A huge disc of teeth that eventually opens out and then closes. It snaps onto its prey, brings it right back to its mouth, and then just crunches down. In comparison to a whole bunch of other animals in the Cambrian period, this thing was huge. And when I say huge, I legitimately mean huge. A lot of animals in the Cambrian period were only just around about a couple of centimeters long. You can get a ruler out and it can easily dwarf a lot of a Cambrian period animal. However, when it came to Anomalocaris, it was around about a meter or so long. Whilst that does sound very much impressive for an animal like Anomalocaris, and for the longest time this thing was considered the apex predator of the actual Cambrian period, that was until 1994, where this behemoth was discovered. Omnidens was an actual mammoth of a time period and was easily the apex predator as soon as it was discovered. Whilst a lot of these drawings that I'm showing you are easily over-exaggerating its overall size, its fossil does not lie in terms of how big it can be. Now, when I say fossil, the only thing that was discovered was its crushed body, in other words, its jaws and what it used to hunt. Now, when I say that, you may be possibly thinking to yourselves, are there any other fossils of it discovered? There might be, but as far as we can tell, there may not be, because this thing's fossil easily tells us that this thing was a soft-bodied worm. That's right, in comparison to Anomalocaris, which was a hard-shelled shrimp, this thing was a soft-bodied worm, and it easily dwarfed the Anomalocaris. To get a good size comparison of all of these wonderful animals in terms of how big they are in comparison to, let's say, us, here you go! Now you know how big these things were and how small these things were. The majority of life in the Paleozoic time period was just, well, tiny. The Cambrian explosion only had smaller hopes of life forms in terms of size, but it easily made up for it in terms of experimentation and what would happen later on down the road in terms of life on Earth. However, when it came to it all as a whole, their time did eventually came to an end, especially when the Great Dying came round the corner. But when the Great Dying came round the corner, the dinosaurs eventually came up and took center hole. Of course, it took a few million years for the dinosaurs to eventually come round the corner, but you get the point I'm trying to get across. As much as I want to say that I really do like the archetype of Paleozoics, and I really do enjoy studying about the Cambrian period when I have the time, I can't help but to say that I'm a little bit disappointed in terms of how time has been to the Paleozoic archetype. Which is kind of unfortunate, because up until the dinosaur structure deck, these guys were the only decent paleontology-themed deck. And only 2 or 3 of their cards are now used in any forms of decks whatsoever, which is kind of a shame. Even if Omnidus does get an eventual monster form in the Paleozoic archetype, I hardly doubt it will do anything to help the deck whatsoever. But if it does, I'll be surprised if it makes the other monsters a whole lot more of a threat to deal with. But until then, we can only hope to see what kind of support the Paleozoics get, if they do get any support. Once again, I want to thank RainingCardGames for helping me out with this video. This video was actually in the woodworks for a long time, and I actually been purposely holding back, apparently because of my dying computer. So I'm actually taking a gamble with this video as a whole on what legs my computer may have left, until I get my new one. So, thank you once again for RainingCardGames for helping me out with this video. If you guys like this video, then drop this video a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel for hopefully some more paleontology and Yu-Gi-Oh coming on later on soon. And until next time, I bid you all adieu.